The sky over the small town of Oakhaven was the color of a bruised plum, heavy with the threat of a downpour that had been teasing the rooftops since dawn. For Margaret, the dampness in the air was more than just a weather report. It was a dull ache in her knuckles and a stiffness in her lower back that made every movement feel like she was pulling herself through honey. She sat at her small laminate kitchen table, sipping a cup of tea that had gone lukewarm, staring at a flyer that had been tucked into her screen door the evening before. Estate sale. Everything must go. 422 West Birch Street. Margaret didn't need anything. Her small apartment was already a museum of a life lived in half with her husband Arthur and half without him. But the walls of her home had started to feel like they were leaning in a little too close lately. The silence of the hallway was too loud. She needed a reason to put on her coat, to feel the gravel crunch under her sensible shoes, and to hear the murmur of other human voices. Even if they were just strangers haggling over old spoons, she pulled on her heavy wool coat, the one with the missing middle button she always meant to sew back on, and grabbed her floral umbrella. The walk to Birch Street took longer than it used to. She moved with a slow, rhythmic shuffle, her eyes mostly fixed on the sidewalk to avoid any slick patches of wet leaves. When she arrived at the house, it was a grand Victorian structure that had clearly seen better days. The paint was peeling in long, jagged strips like sunburnt skin, and the porch sagged in the middle. A small crowd of people had already gathered, huddled under umbrellas. They weren't the high-end antique dealers Margaret sometimes saw on television. These were neighbors, bargain hunters, and people looking for cheap tools or mismatched Tupperware. A man in a bright orange vest stood by the front door, shouting instructions about not touching the fragile glass and keeping the line moving. Margaret slipped inside, welcomed by the smell of old paper, mothballs, and the lingering scent of many years of cooking. The house was a labyrinth of memories that didn't belong to her. She wandered through the living room, passing by velvet armchairs that had lost their spring and bookshelves filled with encyclopedias that no one used anymore. She found herself drawn toward the back of the house, where the kitchen met a small, glassed-in sunroom. This area was less organized. Boxes were piled haphazardly on top of one another, filled with the odds and ends that the organizers hadn't bothered to price individually. There were rusted egg beaters, cracked ceramic mugs, and bundles of old linens tied together with twine. In the corner, sitting on a low folding table, was a cardboard box marked kitchen scraps, $1 each. Margaret leaned over, her joints protesting the movement. She began to sift through the items. Her fingers brushed against something cold and surprisingly heavy. She reached deeper, pulling aside a stained tablecloth, and unearthed a bowl. It was a hideous thing at first glance. It was covered in a thick, sticky layer of what looked like kitchen grease, mixed with decades of dust. The surface was a dull, mottled brown, looking more like a discarded piece of industrial plumbing than a household item. It was lumpy and uneven, as if someone had tried to paint it with a thick, cheap varnish that had bubbled over time. "It's heavy, isn't it?" A voice rasped. Margaret startled, nearly dropping the bowl. An elderly man, one of the helpers, was leaning against the doorframe, chewing on a toothpick. "It is," Margaret replied, her voice a bit thin. "I was looking for something to put my keys in. My current dish broke last week." The man walked over and squinted at the bowl. He picked it up, turned it over, and gave it a dismissive shrug. "Looks like lead, or some cheap brass alloy. Probably came out of a garage. It's ugly as sin, but it'll hold keys just fine. Tell you what's at the end of the hour. Give me 50 cents and it's yours. I don't want to have to carry it to the dumpster later." Margaret felt a small spark of pity for the object. It was so unwanted, so overlooked, much like she felt on the days when the phone didn't ring. She reached into her small coin purse, her fingers dancing past the bills she saved for groceries, and fished out 2 quarters. 50 cents sounds fair," she said. Nodding, the man didn't even give her a bag. He just took the coins and moved on to the next person. Margaret wrapped the heavy, grimy bowl in the corner of her floral umbrella to keep the grease off her coat and began the long walk home. By the time she reached her front door, the rain had finally started to fall in earnest. She let herself in, shook out her umbrella, and set the bowl on the kitchen counter. In the bright fluorescent light of her kitchen, The object looked even worse. It left a dark, oily ring on her clean countertop. She stood there for a moment, wondering why she had bothered. She had spent 50 cents on a piece of trash. She almost picked it up to throw it in the bin under the sink, but something stopped her. Underneath the smell of old grease, there was a weight to it that felt substantial and importance that didn't match its outward appearance. Margaret pulled a pair of yellow rubber gloves from under the sink and reached for the scouring pad. She didn't know it yet, but as she turned on the tap and let the hot water steam up the window, she was about to peel back the first layer of a secret that had been hidden for generations. The steam from the kitchen sink rose up and fogged Margaret's glasses, but she didn't mind. There was something therapeutic about the heat on her hands. She had always found peace in cleaning. It was a way to exert control over a world that often felt chaotic. She set the heavy, ugly bowl into the soapy water. At first, the water didn't even seem to penetrate the grime. The grease was thick and stubborn, smelling faintly of old cigarette smoke and burnt lard. It was the kind of filth that takes decades to accumulate. A protective shell of neglect. She picked up a stiff-bristled brush and began to scrub. Her movements were slow and methodical. She thought about the house where the bowl had come from. Who had owned it? Had it sat in a dark corner of a basement for 40 years? Or had someone used it as an ashtray in a garage? As she worked, a dark, muddy sludge began to swirl in the sink. The brown varnish, which she had assumed was the actual color of the metal, began to flake away in jagged patches. Underneath the first layer, something strange happened. The water hitting the bowl didn't sound like it was hitting cheap tin or hollow brass. It had a deep, resonant ring to it, a musical note that lingered in the small kitchen. Margaret paused, wiping her brow with the back of her wrist. She rinsed the bowl under the cold tap, and her heart gave a small, fluttering hop. A tiny patch of the surface had cleared, and it wasn't the dull, greenish yellow of old brass. It was a bright, soft, unmistakable glow. It looked like a piece of the sun had been trapped under the kitchen grease. "That can't be right," she whispered to the empty room. She reached for a stronger cleaning agent, a paste she usually reserved for the silver tea set her mother had left her. She applied it with a soft cloth, rubbing in small, tight circles. As the minutes ticked by, the transformation became undeniable. The more she rubbed, the more the brass disappeared. It wasn't a coating. The metal itself was changing. It was a deep, rich, yellow, heavy, and soft. She remembered her husband, Walter. He hadn't been a jeweler, but he had spent 40 years working as a fine watchmaker. He used to sit at the dining room table with a magnifying loupe pressed to his eye, tinkering with tiny gears and gold springs. He had taught her the difference between things that were gold-colored and things that were gold. "Gold has a warmth to it," Margaret, he used to say. "It's heavy in a way that feels honest. It doesn't try to be anything else." This bowl felt honest. It was incredibly heavy for its size, so heavy that her wrist began to ache from holding it under the faucet. When she finally finished scrubbing the interior and the outer rim, she sat the bowl down on a clean white dish towel. The contrast was startling. The bowl beamed against the white fabric. It wasn't just clean. It was radiant. But it was the bottom of the bowl that gave her the biggest shock. She turned it over to dry the base, and there, stamped into the metal with incredible precision, was a series of tiny symbols. There was a crown, a leopard's head, and a specific letter M inside a shield. Next to those symbols was a hand-engraved crest lion holding a sword. It looked like a royal seal, something that belonged in a history book, not a 50-cent box at a rainy estate sale. Margaret's breath hitched. She felt a sudden, sharp wave of anxiety. It was the kind of feeling you get when you realize you've accidentally walked away with something that doesn't belong to you. She looked at the kitchen door, almost expecting the man in the orange vest to knock and demand the bowl back. She picked up her phone, her fingers trembling slightly as she tried to use the search engine. She typed in the descriptions of the marks: leopard head hallmark, lion with sword crest, heavy yellow metal bowl. The results that flickered onto the screen made her dizzy. Words like sovereign, 22 carat, and pre-war artifact jumped out at her. One article showed a similar crest belonging to a family in Europe that had lost their entire estate during the chaos of the 1940s. The article mentioned that many of their pieces had been painted over with lead-based paint or cheap lacquer to hide their value from looters as they were smuggled across borders. Margaret sat down at her table, the bowl sitting between her and her half-eaten piece of toast. She thought about the 50 cents she had paid. She thought about the man who had called it ugly as sin. If this bowl was what she thought it wasn't just a key dish. It was worth more than her car. It was worth more than her apartment. It was a fortune sitting on a stained dish towel. She felt a strange sense of responsibility wash over her. This wasn't just gold. It was a survivor. It had been hidden, disguised, and tossed around in boxes for 80 years, waiting for someone to finally see it for what it truly was. "What am I going to do with you?" she asked the bowl. She knew she couldn't keep it in the house. The neighborhood was quiet, but secrets like this had a way of leaking out. She felt a sudden urge to hide it, to put the grime back on, but it was too late. The gold was out in the light now. She spent the rest of the evening wrapped in a blanket, staring at the bowl. She didn't turn on the television. She didn't listen to the radio. She just watched the way the light from the street lamp outside caught the rim of the gold. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the lion with the sword. She knew that tomorrow she would have to leave her comfort zone. She would have to go to the city, to the district where the tall buildings stood and the shops had security guards at the doors. She was just an elderly woman in a coat with a missing button. But she was carrying a piece of history in a grocery bag as she finally headed to bed. She tucked the bowl into a shoebox and hid it under a pile of sweaters in her closet. That night, for the first time in years, she didn't dream of the past. She dreamed of a golden light that filled her entire house, turning the walls into honey and the floor into sunbeams. The next morning arrived with a cold, biting wind that rattled the window panes of Margaret's bedroom. Usually, she would stay in bed for an extra hour on mornings like this, letting the heater hum until the air was warm enough for her old bones. But today, her eyes snapped open before the sun was even up. Her heart was thumping in nervous rhythm against her ribs. She looked toward her closet, where the shoebox sat tucked beneath her cardigans. It felt like the box was glowing, even through the wood of the door. She dressed with extra care. She chose her best blouse, the pale blue one with the lace collar, spent a long time brushing her hair until it sat perfectly. She felt like she was preparing for a job interview or a court date. She wasn't just Margaret the widow today. She was the guardian of something ancient. She took the bowl out of the shoebox. In the morning light, it looked even more spectacular. She wrapped it carefully in an old silk scarf, then placed it inside a sturdy canvas grocery bag. To anyone else on the bus, she would just look like an elderly lady going to buy some bread or visit the library. That was the plan. Safety was in being invisible. The bus ride to the city center took nearly an hour. Margaret sat near the front, her hands gripped tightly around the handles of her bag. Every time the bus jolted or hit a pothole, she winced, fearing the metal would clink and draw attention. She watched the scenery change from the quiet, leafy streets of her suburb to the gray, towering concrete of the downtown district. The city felt louder than she remembered. It felt faster. People rushed past each other without a glance, their heads buried in their phones. When she finally reached the jewelry district, she felt small. The shop windows were filled with sparkling diamonds and watches that cost more than her entire house. She walked past 3 different stores before she found the one she was looking for. Holloway & Son, Fine Arts and Antiquities. It didn't have flashing neon signs. It had a heavy oak door and a small, discreet brass plaque. Margaret took a deep breath, adjusted her coat, and pushed the door open. A little bell chimed somewhere in the back. The air inside was cool and smelled of beeswax and expensive cologne. Behind a glass counter sat a man who looked like he had been born in a suit. He was younger than Margaret expected, perhaps in his late 30s, with sharp eyes and a very straight back. "Good morning," the man said, his voice smooth and professional. "Do you have an appointment, or are you looking for a valuation?" Margaret cleared her throat, her voice coming out a bit raspy. I have something I'd like you to look at. I found it at a sale. I think it might be important." The man, whose name tag read Arthur, a name that gave Margaret a small jolt of comfort, gave a polite, slightly tired smile. He had likely seen hundreds of people come in with silver-plated spoons and rare coins that were worth nothing. Of course, if you could place the item on the velvet pad here, I'll take a look. Margaret's hands shook as she reached into her bag. She unwrapped the silk scarf slowly, revealing the deep buttery yellow of the bowl. The man's smile didn't just fade. It vanished. He didn't say a word. He didn't even reach for the bowl at first. He just stared at it. The silence in the shop stretched out until it felt heavy. "Where did you say you got this?" he asked, his voice much lower now. "An estate sale," Margaret whispered. "On Birch Street. It was covered in grease. I paid 50 cents. The man reached into a drawer and pulled out a magnifying loupe. He didn't just glance at the bowl. He studied it inch by inch. He turned it over to look at the hallmark, and Margaret saw his fingers tremble. He then picked up a small electronic scale and weighed the piece. "Ma'am," he said, looking up at her. His face was pale. "I need you to sit down." Margaret sat in the velvet chair behind her. Is it real?" "Real isn't the word for it," the man said. He walked over to the front door and turned the lock, flipping the sign to closed. Margaret's heart raced. Was she in trouble? "This isn't just gold," he continued, returning to the counter. "This is a very specific type of high-purity gold that hasn't been used in commercial jewelry for a very long time. But more importantly, the hallmark on the bottom. It belongs to a master goldsmith from the 18th century who worked specifically for the royal courts of Eastern Europe." He leaned in closer. "I've seen pictures of this piece in catalogs of lost treasures. It was part of a collection that disappeared during the Second World War. Historians assumed it had been melted down by looters decades ago. The fact that it's sitting here on my counter, because you found it in a dollar box?" He trailed off, shaking his head in disbelief. "What is it worth?" Margaret asked, her voice barely a breath. The appraiser looked at the bowl and then back at her. "As gold scrap alone, it's worth about $40,000. But as a historical artifact with this specific provenance, at auction, you are looking at a minimum of $250,000, possibly much more if two museums start a bidding war." The room seemed to spin. Margaret felt the walls of her tiny apartment, the bills on her counter, and the struggle of the last 10 years suddenly falling away. $250,000. It was an impossible number. It was a life jacket in a sea she had been drowning in. "However," the appraiser said, his tone turning serious, "there is a complication. Because this is a registered lost artifact, there are laws about its return. The family who originally owned this, their descendants are still alive. They've been looking for their family history for 80 years. He looked at Margaret with a mixture of pity and respect. "Legally, because you bought it fairly at an estate sale that had no reserved items, you have a very strong claim to keep it or sell it. You could walk out of here, go to an auction house, and never have to worry about money again. Or we could contact the family's estate. They likely can't afford to buy it back at full price, but it is their heritage." Margaret looked at the bowl. She saw her own reflection in the polished gold-attired elderly woman who just wanted to be able to turn the heat up in the winter without checking her bank balance. Then she thought about the lion with the sword crest. That crest meant something to a family. It was their name. It was their blood. "If I sell it," Margaret asked, "what happens to the family?" "They lose it forever," the man replied. "It goes into a private collection, probably in a vault in another country. They'll never see it again." Margaret felt a lump in her throat. She had spent so long feeling like she was losing things: her husband, her youth, her place in the world. She knew what it felt like to have a gap where a memory should be. "I need some time," she said, her voice stronger now. "I need to think," the appraiser nodded. "Take all the time you need. But please, don't take the bus home with that in a grocery bag. I'm going to call a private car for you. It's on the house." As Margaret sat in the back of the sleek black car on the way home, the shoebox on her lap felt heavier than ever. She wasn't just carrying gold anymore. She was carrying someone else's history. The shock of the value was starting to fade, replaced by a much deeper, more difficult question. What was worth more, her future comfort or a stranger's past? The house was quieter than usual when Margaret returned. Even the hum of the refrigerator seemed to have lowered its volume, as if it, too, was waiting for her to make a move. She placed the shoebox on her small dining table and sat down, not even taking off her coat. The black car the appraiser had called for her had felt like a dream, the leather seats. The quiet engine, the way people on the street looked at the tinted windows with curiosity. For a few minutes, she had felt like royalty. But now, back in her kitchen, with the peeling wallpaper and the cracked linoleum, the reality of the situation began to settle into her bones. $250,000. She stood up and walked to the kitchen counter, picking up a small stack of envelopes she had been avoiding. There was the electricity bill, which had gone up again this month. There was a notice from her landlord about a planned rent increase in the spring. There was a medical statement for the physical therapy she had. Stopped attending because the copay was too high. If she sold the bowl, all of those papers would disappear. She could move to a house with a garden. She could hire a nurse to help her with the heavy lifting. She could buy her grandchildren the college funds she had always wished she could provide. She could finally stop worrying about the price of eggs, or whether she could afford to keep the heat at 70 degrees during a snowstorm. "It's just a bowl," she whispered to the shadows in the corner. "It's just metal. They don't even know it exists." She took the bowl out of the box one more time. She ran her thumb over the crest the lion with the sword. She thought about the family the appraiser had mentioned. He had said they were the descendants of the original owners. He had mentioned they were struggling to keep a family library open. Margaret thought back to her own childhood. She remembered her father's old wooden watchmaking bench. After he passed away, the family had been forced to sell his tools just to keep the roof over their heads. She still remembered the sight of those specialized tweezers and tiny screwdrivers being hauled away by a stranger for a fraction of what they were worth. It had felt like selling a piece of her father's soul. To this day, she regretted not being able to keep even one small gear to remember him by. Was she about to do the same thing to another family? She spent the next few hours pacing the length of her small hallway. One moment, she was convinced she should sell it. "I found it," she told herself. "I saw the value when no one else did. I did the work to clean it. It's mine by right." But then she would look at the bowl and see not a fortune, but a survivor of a war. It had been disguised in grease and grime to save it from people who wanted to steal it. It had waited 80 years to be found. Did it wait all that time just to be sold to the highest bidder and hidden away in another vault? She pulled out an old photo album and looked at a picture of Walter. He was smiling, his hands covered in oil from a clock he was fixing. He had been a man of immense integrity. He used to say that a watch that didn't keep honest time wasn't a watch at all, it was just jewelry. He believed that things had a purpose and a place where they belonged. "What would you do, Walter?" she asked the photograph. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was clarifying. She knew what he would do. He would return the time to the person who lost it. The next morning, Margaret didn't go to the auction house. Instead, she called the number the appraiser Arthur had given her. Her voice was steady, though her heart was hammering. "Arthur, it's Margaret. About the bowl. I've made my decision. I don't want to go to auction. I want you to call the family. I want to meet them." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Are you sure, ma'am? You realize that by doing this, you are likely giving up a life-changing amount of money. I can't guarantee they will be able to offer you anything more than a finder's fee." "I'm sure," Margaret said, and for the first time in years, she felt a strange light bubbling in her chest. It was the feeling of being in charge of her own story. "Money changes your life, Arthur, but it doesn't change who you are. I'd rather sleep well in a cold house than stay awake in a mansion wondering whose history I sold to pay for it." 2 days later, the meeting was set. Margaret went back to the city, but this time she didn't feel small. She carried the bag with a sense of pride. When she entered the back room of the jewelry shop, 2 people were waiting for her. They weren't the wealthy aristocrats she had imagined. They were a young couple, both looking tired and dressed in modest, well-worn clothes. The woman had a scarf wrapped around her neck that looked like it had been knitted by a grandmother. And the man held a worn leather briefcase. When Margaret pulled the bowl from the bag and set it on the table, The woman let out a small, choked sob. She didn't reach for it as if it were money. She reached for it as if it were a lost child. Her fingers traced the lion crest with a reverence that made Margaret's eyes sting. "My grandfather used to tell me stories about this," the woman whispered, her voice trembling. "He said it was the last thing his mother touched before they had to flee. He thought it was gone. He died thinking his whole history had been erased." The man looked at Margaret, his eyes filled with a profound gratitude that no check could ever express. "We've spent 10 years trying to track down the pieces of our family's library and collection. We don't have much. We've poured everything we have into keeping the doors open so people can learn about the history that was almost lost." He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a folder. "We can't pay you the $250,000 it's worth on the open market. We just don't have it. We managed to raise $20,000 by taking out a loan against our own home. It's all we have to offer you as a thank you." Margaret looked at the young couple. She saw their passion, their struggle, and their honesty. She looked at the $20,000, a sum that would pay off her debts and give her a comfortable cushion. But nothing like the fortune she was giving up. She felt a moment of hesitation. It was the final test. She could still say no. She could still walk away and call the auction house. But then the woman reached out and took Margaret's hand. Her skin was warm and her grip was firm. "Thank you," she whispered. "You didn't just find a bowl. You found us." Margaret smiled, and in the last of her doubts vanished. "Keep your money," Margaret said, her voice soft but clear. "If you're struggling to keep that library open, you need it more than I do. Just give me enough to pay for my bus ride home and maybe a nice dinner. That's all I need." The couple looked at her in total shock. Arthur, the appraiser, stood in the corner, his jaw practically on the floor. No one moved. The air in the room felt thick with a kind of goodness that was rare in the world. "But wait," the man said, his eyes widening as he remembered something. He looked at the bowl, then back at the woman. "The secret? We have to show her the secret," Margaret frowned. "What secret?" The man picked up the bowl and turned it over. He didn't look at the hallmarks this time. Instead, he pressed to specific points on the ornate rim of the base simultaneously. There was a faint, metallic click sound Margaret recognized from her husband's workshop. The bottom of the bowl, which appeared to be solid gold, shifted. It began to rotate. Margaret leaned in, her breath catching in her throat as a hidden compartment, no thicker than a coin, slowly slid open. The sound of the small metallic click echoed in the quiet room of the jewelry shop. Margaret leaned forward, her heart racing faster than it had when she first found the bowl in the rain. She watched as the man carefully slid the false bottom of the gold vessel to the side. It was a masterpiece of hidden engineering. A secret pocket designed by a craftsman who knew that sometimes the only way to save what is precious is to hide it in plain sight. Inside the thin, velvet-lined compartment sat 3 small folded pieces of parchment, yellowed by time and smelling faintly of cedar, but it was what lay beneath the papers that caught the light. 3 stones. They weren't set in rings or necklaces. They were raw, uncut, and roughly the size of acorns. In the dim light of the shop, they looked like dull pebbles at first, but as the appraiser Arthur adjusted his desk lamp, they erupted with a deep inner fire. They were emeralds intense, forest green stones of a quality that Margaret had only ever seen in movies. The young woman gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "The stars of the family," she whispered. "My grandfather said they were hidden inside the sun bowl, but we always thought it was just a fairy tale he told to keep us hopeful." Arthur reached for his loupe again, his hands visibly shaking now. He didn't even pick the stones up. He just leaned over them, his breath hitching. "These aren't just emeralds," he muttered. "These are from the old mines of Colombia. They haven't pulled stones this clean out of the earth in a century, and because they are uncut, they haven't been touched by modern tools. They are pure history." He looked up at Margaret, then at the young couple. The air in the room felt electric, charged with a reality that was shifting second by second. "The bowl is worth a fortune," Arthur said, his voice cracking. "But these stones? They are worth millions. They are the kind of discovery that changes the history of a museum." Margaret felt a strange wave of calm wash over her. Just moments ago, she had offered to give the bowl back for nothing, content to return to her quiet life with the knowledge that she had done the right thing. Now the stakes had been raised to a level she couldn't even fathom. She looked at the young couple. They were staring at the stones with tears streaming down their faces. They weren't looking at dollar signs. They were looking at the survival of their family's dream. The man, whose name was Thomas, looked at Margaret. He took a deep breath and pushed the bowl, the papers, and the emeralds across the table toward her. "This is yours," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You bought the bowl? You found the secret. You were willing to give it all back to us when you thought it was just gold? We cannot, in good conscience, take this from you. You are the one the universe chose to find it." Margaret looked at the emeralds, then at the couple's worn shoes and tired eyes. She thought about her cold apartment and her husband Walter's old watchmaking bench. She thought about the honesty that had defined her life, even when times were hard. "No," Margaret said, her voice firm. She pushed the bowl back to the center of the table. "We are going to do this together." The room went silent. "I don't need millions of dollars," Margaret continued, a small smile playing on her lips. "At my age, $1 million is just a bigger house to clean and more people asking for favors. But I do need to know that I can keep my lights on. And you two, you need to keep that library open. You need to tell the world the story of the people who were brave enough to hide these stones in a 50-cent bowl." She looked at Arthur. "Can you help us sell the stones? Keep one for the family library as a centerpiece and sell the other two. We split the proceeds 3 ways. One for the library, one for the family, and one for a grumpy old woman who just wanted a place to put her keys." The young woman threw her arms around Margaret, sobbing into her shoulder. It wasn't the shock of the money that moved Margaret the most. It was the feeling of being needed, of being part of a family again. The months that followed were a whirlwind. The sale of the 2 emeralds made international headlines. Collectors from across the globe bid on the widow's stones, as the press called them. When the final hammer fell at the auction, the amount was so large that Margaret had to sit down when she saw the numbers on her. New bank statement. But Margaret didn't buy a mansion. She stayed in her neighborhood, though she did move into a small, beautiful cottage with a garden that looked out over the park. She hired a gardener, a young man who was struggling to pay for trade school, and she paid him triple the going rate. She bought a new car, but it was a simple, reliable one that was easy for her to get in and out of. The biggest change, however, was on Birch Street. With her share of the money, Margaret and the young couple bought the old Victorian house where the estate sale had been held. They spent a year restoring it, peeling back the old paint and fixing the sagging porch today. That house is no longer a place of dusty boxes and forgotten junk. It is the Oak Haven History and Heritage Center. The library is on the first floor, filled with the books the young couple worked so hard to save. And in the center of the main room, under a thick layer of bulletproof glass, sits a buttery yellow gold bowl. There is a small plaque beneath the display. It doesn't talk about the millions of dollars or the international auctions. It simply says the golden vessel. Found by Margaret, a reminder that what is truly valuable is often hidden under a layer of dust, waiting for a pair of honest hands to find it. Margaret visits the center every Tuesday. She sits in a comfortable armchair by the window, sipping a cup of tea that never goes cold because the building has the best heating system money can buy. Sometimes people recognize her from the newspapers and ask her if she regrets. It's not keeping all the money for herself. She always looks at the bowl, then at the children reading books in the library, and then at the young couple who now call her Aunt Margaret. "Regret," she says with a twinkle in her eye. "I spent 50 cents and I bought myself a family and a reason to get out of bed in the morning. I think I got the better end of the deal." As the sun sets over Oak Haven, the light hits the gold bowl in the window, and for a moment, the whole street seems to glow with a warmth that has nothing to do with the weather. It is the glow of a story that finally found its way home. The fame didn't arrive with a whisper. It arrived with a roar. Within a week of the auction, Margaret's quiet life in Oak Haven was turned upside down. News vans, with satellite dishes parked along the curb of her narrow street, and reporters in expensive coats stood on her sidewalk, practicing their serious faces for the camera. They called her the 50-cent millionaire and the Lady of the Emeralds. Everyone wanted a piece of her time, a quote for their headline, or a photo of her holding the grocery bag that had once carried a fortune. Margaret watched them through the slats of her Venetian blinds. She felt like a bird in a cage. She had lived 78 years in relative obscurity. And suddenly, the world decided she was the most interesting person alive. It was exhausting. People she hadn't spoken to in 20 years were suddenly calling her old landline, telling her how much they had always admired her spirit, before pivoting to a story about their own financial troubles. But Margaret was no fool. She knew that the bright lights of the media were like a summer storm, intense and loud, but bound to pass eventually. She stayed inside, sipping her tea and waiting for the chaos to settle. She wasn't hiding because she was afraid. She was hiding because she wanted to protect the peace she had worked so hard to build. One afternoon, when the crowd of reporters had thinned out due to a heavy drizzle, there was a knock on her door. It wasn't the aggressive, rhythmic thumping of a journalist. It was a soft, hesitant tapping. Margaret looked through the peephole. Standing on her porch was a young boy, perhaps 10 years old, wearing a yellow raincoat that was 2 sizes too big. He was holding a small, crumpled paper bag. She opened the door just a crack. "Can I help you, dear?" The boy looked up, his eyes wide. "Are you the lady who found the gold?" Margaret sighed softly. "I am Margaret, yes." The boy held out the paper bag. "I found this at a yard sale down the street. It cost me a nickel. It's a metal box with a weird lock. I thought maybe you could tell me if it's special. I want to help my mom pay the rent." Margaret felt a lump form in her throat. This was the unintended consequence of her story. She had given people hope, but she had also made them look at every piece of junk as a potential miracle. She stepped aside and invited the boy in. They sat at her kitchen table, the same table where she had once scrubbed the grease off the gold bowl. She looked at the boy's treasure. It was a simple tin biscuit box from the 1950s, rusted at the hinges and smelling of old flour. It wasn't gold. It wasn't a historical artifact. It was exactly what it looked like. A piece of discarded history worth, maybe, a few cents to a collector of tins. She could have told him the truth bluntly. She could have said it was trash. But she looked at the boy's hopeful face and remembered how she had felt when she saw that bowl sitting in the dollar box. She remembered the feeling of needing a win, of needing the world to finally be kind. "Well," Margaret said, picking up the tin and turning it over in her hands. "It's not made of gold, and it doesn't have any hidden emeralds. But look here at the artwork on the lid. See those colors? That's a specific style of printing they don't do anymore. And look at the name on the bottom. It was made in a factory that closed down a long time ago."
Oh.
The boy's shoulders slumped slightly. "So it's not worth millions?" "No," Margaret said gently. "But it's a piece of time. And sometimes the value of a thing isn't in what a museum will pay for it. It's in the story it tells." She reached into her purse and pulled out a $20 bill. "I've been looking for a tin just like this to keep my sewing needles in. My old one is falling apart. Would you consider selling it to me for $20? The boy's eyes lit up like lanterns. $20? For real? For real, she said, handing him the bill. As the boy ran out the door, clutching the money and shouting for his mother, Margaret sat back down. She realized then that her life hadn't just changed because she was rich. It had changed because she now had the power to be the miracle. For someone else, she decided then that she wouldn't spend her days hiding from the world. She would use her share of the money to create a foundation, not a big, corporate one with lawyers and fancy offices, but a small, local fund. She called it the Second Chance Fund. It was designed to help people in Oak Haven with the small things that felt like big things. It was a new set of tires so someone could get to work, a repaired roof for a widow, or a scholarship for a kid who had a talent for fixing things. The young couple from the library helped her manage it. They became her hands and feet in the community. Thomas and his wife would bring her files on Tuesday nights, and they would sit on her porch, going over the names of people who needed a little bit of the luck that Margaret had found in that box on Birch Street. One evening, Thomas asked her, "Don't you ever miss the bowl, Margaret? It was yours, after all. You could have kept it on your mantle." Margaret looked out at her new garden, where the roses were beginning to bloom in shades of deep crimson and pale pink. The bowl was a heavy thing, Thomas. It was a weight. It belonged to the past, what I have now. This life, these roses, the way that little boy looked when he got that $20 bill. That's light. I've spent enough of my life carrying heavy things. I'd rather be light. The story of the bowl eventually faded from the front pages of the newspapers. The reporters moved on to the next big scandal, or the next lucky lottery winner. But in the town of Oak Haven, the story stayed alive. It didn't stay alive as a legend of wealth, but as a lesson in how to treat a neighbor. Margaret lived many more years in her cottage. She became a fixture of the town, the lady who always had a kind word and a sharp eye for a bargain. She still went to estate sales, but she never looked for gold anymore. She looked for things that were broken but could be fixed. She looked for things that were lonely but could be loved. On the day she finally passed away, peacefully in her sleep, the entire town turned out for her service. There were no politicians or celebrities. There were just people like the boy in the yellow raincoat, the gardener she had overpaid, and the couple from the library at the end of the service. They didn't place a wreath of expensive lilies on her grave. Instead, the young woman from the library stepped forward and placed a small, tarnished brass key on the headstone. She found the gold, the woman said to the crowd, her voice cracking with emotion. But the real treasure was the door she opened for the rest of us. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of the Oak Haven History and Heritage Center, casting long golden rectangles across the polished wooden floors. It had been 5 years since Margaret had first picked up that greasy bowl, and 3 years since she had passed away. But her presence was felt in every corner of the building. The center had become the heart of the town, a place where the air always felt a little warmer and the world felt a little kinder. Thomas and his wife sat in the small office at the back of the building, the same room where they had once cried over the discovery of the emeralds. They were no longer the struggling, exhausted couple Margaret had first met. They looked healthy and grounded, though they still dressed in the same simple, practical clothes they always had. For them, the wealth Margaret had shared wasn't a ticket to a life of luxury. It was a sacred trust to be managed for the good of the community. "There's a letter for you," his wife said, placing a thick, cream-colored envelope on his desk. "It's from the law firm that handled Margaret's final estate. They said it was to be opened specifically today, the 5th anniversary of the sale." Thomas looked at the envelope. His hands were steady, but he felt a familiar lump in his throat. Margaret had always been a woman of surprises, and even from the other side she seemed to be guiding them. He carefully slit the envelope open. Inside was a single key, an old-fashioned iron one with a bit of rust on the handle, and a short note written in Margaret's shaky but elegant cursive. "To my dear friends," the note began. "If you are reading this, it means you have kept the library open and the coffee hot. I am so proud of the work you've done, but there is one last thing you need to know. The bowl wasn't the only thing I bought that day on Birch Street. I went back before the house was cleared out and bought the old workbench in the garage for $5. I told the man it was for my garden, but I lied. I wanted it because it reminded me of Walter. It's in the storage unit under my name. Go to the bench. Look behind the 3rd drawer. Some treasures don't shine, but they are the most valuable of all." Thomas and his wife didn't say a word. They grabbed their coats and drove out to the small storage facility on the edge of town. When they opened the unit, it smelled of cedar and old machine oil. There, sitting in the middle of the room, was a heavy, scarred wooden workbench. It was covered in nicks from saws and stains from spilled varnish. It looked like a piece of junk to anyone else, just like the bowl had. Thomas pulled out the 3rd drawer. It was filled with old screws and dried-up glue bottles. He reached his hand into the dark space behind where the drawer sat, his fingers brushing against the rough wood of the frame. He felt a small, leather-bound book tucked into a hidden wooden pocket. He pulled it out and wiped away the dust. It wasn't a ledger or a bank book. It was a diary. But as he flipped through the pages, he realized it wasn't Margaret's diary. It was a journal kept by the woman who had lived in the Victorian house on Birch Street back in the 1940s, a woman who had first hidden the gold bowl. The couple. sat on the floor of the storage unit, huddled together as they read the words. The diary explained everything. It told the story of how a young woman had been given the bowl by a fleeing family and how she had promised to protect it. It detailed how she had used her last bit of money to buy cheap black paint and grease to make the gold look like common lead, hoping that looters would pass it by. But the last page of the diary was the most important. It contained a list of names families from across the ocean who had lost everything. The woman had written, "I cannot find them now, but one day someone will find this bowl. If they are an honest person, they will seek the truth. To that person, the gold is yours, but the names in this book are your real mission. Find them. Tell them they were remembered." Thomas looked at his wife, tears blurring his vision. She knew, he whispered. Margaret didn't just find a bowl. She found a mission. She spent the last years of her life secretly using her share of the money to track down every single family on this list. Look at the check marks. Almost every name on the list had a tiny, neat check mark next to it in Margaret's blue ink. Next to the names were notes like, "Sent grandson to college," or "Paid for granddaughter's surgery," or "Bought back the family farm." Margaret hadn't just built a library. She had quietly restored the lives of dozens of strangers across the world, all without ever taking credit. She had taken the biggest shock of her life and turned it into a silent, global wave of grace. The couple walked out of the storage unit into the bright afternoon light. They felt a sense of peace that was deeper than anything they had ever known. They realized that the story of the elderly woman and her cheapest purchase wasn't about luck or getting rich. It was about the power of one person to see the value in what everyone else had thrown away. They drove back to the center and stood in front of the display case where the gold bowl sat. It looked beautiful, of course, but it no longer felt like the most important thing in the room. The most important thing was the people walking through the doors, the students studying, the elderly men playing chess, the children listening to stories. Thomas placed the diary next to the bowl in the display case. He didn't need to say anything. The people who visited would read the pages and understand. They would see that a 50-cent purchase had grown into a legacy that would last for 100 years. As they locked up the building that night, Thomas looked back at the window. The reflection of the streetlights made the bowl look like it was glowing from within. He thought about Margaret, probably sitting at a kitchen table somewhere in the great beyond with Walter, having a cup of tea and laughing about the 50 cents she had spent on a rainy Saturday. The town of Oak Haven went to sleep, but the light from the center stayed on, a small, steady beam in the darkness. It was a reminder that no matter how much grime or grease the world tries to cover us with, the gold is always there, underneath the surface, waiting for someone with enough heart to start scrubbing. And in that small town, because of one woman's honest hands, everyone started looking at the world a little differently. They started looking at the junk in their lives and wondering what beauty was hidden inside. They started realizing that the cheapest things, kindness, honesty, and a bit of time, were actually the things that no amount of money could ever truly buy.